Nice to get to see some of you now. I'm Jennifer Fletcher. I'm a professor of English at California State University, Monterey Bay. I am delighted to welcome you to our webinar today with Antero Garcia from Stanford University. Oh my gosh, this is going to be a good one. Please do sign in the chat. Let us know where you are from. One of the special things about our ERWC webinar series is that, if you've been coming to these for a while, you're probably going to run into folks in this session. Please do use the chat to connect with each other. If you don't know what ERWC is, we are the expository reading and writing curriculum created through Cal State University. And we are a literacy network, professional learning program, and a secondary school curriculum. We're going to start with just a few updates, and then I'm going to hand things over to Deborah Robinson, our webinar coordinator, who will introduce Antero. And so a few items to share. Next slide. So please do stay connected with our community. You can follow us where we are on social media. Speaking of the art of adaptation, that's kind of another rhetorical problem for us to figure out together. We do have an active ERWC blog just at erwc.blog. And next. Sorry, that was the cat Percy. You can see our social media handles there. And feel free to share your own handles in the chat. This, again, is a great chance to connect with colleagues. Our February webinar will be with Troy Hicks, who is another outstanding literacy leader and really innovative educator, like today's speaker. Next slide. If you are interested in taking an ERWC workshop, we offer them in person and virtually around the state of California. If you are not in California, but you'd like to participate in one of our sessions, we focus on a rhetoric-based, inquiry-based approach to learning. Let us know in the chat and we can connect you with the folks who do our out-of-state work. And next slide. And if you are a California teacher, we are excited that ERWC is going to be at the California Association of Teachers of English in Los Angeles in early March. We not only have quite a robust strand focusing on ERWC pedagogies, but we also are hosting a reception. So 5:30 p.m. that Saturday night in Los Angeles. Please join us and connect with your ERWC colleagues. And next slide. And our own conference will be this June. We'll have the first event in Northern California, June 17th, and then we repeat the same program in Southern California so we can serve the whole state. One more exciting announcement related to the conference. I'm thrilled. Author Trevor Alio is going to be our keynote speaker in both locations. You may have been here for his ERWC webinar or know him as the author, one of the co-authors of Learning That Transfers. He's also an in the classroom teacher who is doing this work every day. And next. And very exciting news. We are continuing to work on publishing our new modules for grades 6 through 8 with integrated and designated ELD. That's funded by a $3 million federal grant. And we have some more exciting news that you're not going to see on a slide. We just found out last month that ERWC was awarded a deep breath here, $15 million grant to develop new curriculum and assess that curriculum for grades 9 and 10. So yay. And if you're interested in being a part of that work, please let us know in the chat. So I'm going to hand things over to Deborah to introduce our speaker.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this month's session of our In the Classroom webinar series. Today, we have a very special guest who's actually closer to home for our California participants. Antero Garcia is an associate professor in the Graduate School of Education at Stanford University and vice president of the National Council of Teachers of English. Prior to completing his PhD, Antero was an English teacher in South Central LA and is recognized today as one of the leading voices shaping the landscape of U.S. public education. So please join me in welcoming Antero to the ERWC community. Welcome, Antero. We're so happy to have you here today.
Thank you, Deborah. I appreciate it. I'm going to get my screen. I'm going to do all the things to share my screen in a moment. But as I'm doing that, I just want to say thank you particularly to everybody, but particularly to Deborah for facilitating, making this opportunity happen, getting to talk with all of you. And you've just been really helpful throughout all this. So I'm really grateful for your time, Deborah. I think this is going to work. We'll see. Let's see. Can people see me on? Am I visible? Great. Okay. I think this is going to work better than like the sharing a screen thing, but maybe not. But we'll go from this. I'm going to try to keep an eye on chat. This says I have 106 slides. There's no way we'll get through all of this. I might just have to jump through some of them at some point. But I'll jump through the board ones so you're not missing anything. And also shout out to Joey who's in Whittier. That is where my in-laws are. I spend a lot of time in Uptown Whittier. So just seeing where everyone is. I forgot that everyone here is mainly from California. So I'm like, I know where all these places are. I grew up in San Diego, taught mostly in LA, work at Stanford, but also currently live in Pasadena. So I spend a lot of time kind of up and down California. So it's good to be in community with all of you. Okay. Okay, so it seems like most of you have kind of found your way to the chat, and I want to spend a couple minutes here before I talk at you for a bunch of time, just by the nature of how webinars work. And so I want to kind of think through, we are maybe about halfway through your school year, depending on what your calendar's like. We are theoretically in an election year, maybe not theoretically. I don't know what the news is bringing us on any given day. But I want you to kind of think through, as you're here on at 4:30 in Pacific time, how are you right now? What are the things that you're holding on to in this moment? What are the things that you're letting go of, as we're turning the corner in January? Let's just take 2 minutes and kind of share a couple of those thoughts in the chat. I'd love to just kind of get a sense of the things that either choose one of those questions and kind of add your sentiment around that. Please. And just as a note, I see someone is driving while they're listening. That person should not add to the chat, although it looks like you already did, because that's how I know that you're driving. But don't type anymore till you get someplace safely. But everyone else, you're still on the hook for throw some thoughts in the chat for a moment. Right. I've seen some really interesting kind of parallels between the things people are holding on to and the things that people are letting go of in terms of relationships and optimism or feelings of control. I like the hopefulness that I'm seeing from some of you about the future or about this semester, maybe the not too distant future. I'd say just in general, I try to start a lot of my classes with my students as well around these kinds of questions, make sure we can ground ourselves to some extent before we jump into any of the kinds of other pieces, right? How can we be whole writers if we can't bring ourselves fully into these kinds of spaces? So I think that's what I'm hoping we can do. But enough of that. It's time to get to brass tacks. We've got a bunch of stuff we got to do. Also, I'm sorry, I'm very sarcastic. If you haven't heard from him, like, why is this jerk yelling at me? I apologize. It's going to kind of be the sentiment for the next few minutes. So just to kind of guide myself so I don't go too fully off the rails, there's this Heinemann book that I got to write with my mentor, Ernest Morel, called Tuned in Teaching. We wrote this book and it kind of came out during the pandemic, and then we just kind of I haven't spent a bunch of time really talking about it. And so my sense is it's not a super expensive book, so feel free to get your school to buy lots of copies for everybody. But other than that, my goal is to really give you some of the big ideas from it over the next 40-ish minutes, and just kind of give it to you. So if you don't buy it, you don't need to now. But buy it for your friends and enemies anyways. So there's 6 different kinds of provocations throughout this. And I'll just say, as I'm going through these, the first 2 are the longest. So if you're looking at the clock and you're like, there's no way he's getting through all 6, you're probably right. Like, I will probably screw this up. But the first few are going to be longer than the latter ones too, just as a sense of where things are. All right. So a little bit of the context. I was on a plane recently and I was reading in November this op-ed from the New York Times about the startling evidence around learning loss. And I have strong feelings about learning loss. I kind of tend to reject the very sentiment of it. Maybe I can make my head bigger, actually. What do you think? Is that going to work? And nope, can't move. Oh, maybe I'll move my head over here. Okay. And so I guess I want to read this second paragraph, these 2 paragraphs that kind of came after the first opening of this editorial. It says, the evidence is now in and is startling. The school closures that took 50 million children out of classrooms at the start of the pandemic may prove to be the most damaging disruption in the history of American education. It also set student progress in math and reading back by 2 decades and widened the achievement gap that separates poor and wealthy children. Those learning losses will remain unaddressed when the federal money runs out in 2024. Economists are predicting that this generation with such a significant education gap will experience diminished lifetime earnings and become a significant drag on the economy. But education administrators and elected officials who should be mobilizing the country against this threat are not. And if you read through one, I'll just be totally upfront. I am skeptical of these kinds of claims. I think the thing that we might have lost might have been a particular kind of sense of progress, but there's been tremendous other kinds of things that have happened since. And we can't go into all of that right now. But I will say, if you read further into this editorial, and if you read into much of the data around learning loss, the solutions are just do more of what has been broken, right? Is largely what the solution is. Which just feels asinine to me as an idea, right? That learning loss is a problem. We should do school harder and faster is largely, I think, what tends to happen. And so that's what I want us to kind of push against. This is the same kind of fear and fear-raising work that we've seen from the 1980s in a report like A Nation at Risk. And in the doctoral seminar that I taught this week for my students here at Stanford, I had them read Experience in Education by John Dewey, nearly a century old, 85 years old at this point. And these are the very ideas of progressive education that Dewey talked about a century ago, right? If we follow kind of the legacy of his work, is what people today like to call project-based learning, right? Or experiential education. And it's just kind of fascinating how we've kind of forgotten some of the very principles of what we thought of as contemporary or non-traditional forms of education that we are stuck with today. And so as we talk about learning loss, I think a lot of this is what are the lessons that we've kind of left on the cutting room floor as we've continued kind of this march towards progress to some extent. And so knowing that, right, I think this is where I get to these kind of 6 different principles for tuned in teaching. This book had a different title, and then Heinemann decided to change it, which was fine. But I do like the idea of kind of putting something to keep us up to date and in touch with the kids today. So putting a radio on the cover of this book was an interesting choice. But I guess the idea of tuned in is fine. But I don't think kids know what tuned in would mean, right? There's nothing to tune. There's no kids don't even use. Anyway, all right, moving on. So first one, centering students. I apologize. Let me move myself. I really should have thought about my digital body on these slides. I want to, as I think about what are the ways that we might transform our classrooms, I want us to move outside of our classrooms for this next bit of time. I'm going to talk about research on school buses. And this comes from another book that I had come out recently called All Through the Town. This link, and I guess I could probably type it in the chat, but it's tinyrole.com/schoolbusbook. You can read the full book there for free. And so don't pay money for it. You could just read it there legally too. It's a real place you can read it. So as we talk about centering students, I think of my colleague at Stanford, Roy P., has this kind of principal idea around cognitive technologies. And he says that technologies reshape who we are by changing what we do. Kind of a very basic definition. I think it's a useful one for us to think about our work. And so the argument that I make in this book is that the most disruptive form of educational technology that has shaped what's happened in US schools over the past century is the school bus, right? More so than iPads or the VCR or the slide rule or the calculator or, heaven forbid, ChatGPT. The school bus is the most disruptive form of educational technology. And the reason it's so disruptive is we don't think of it as a form of technology. Yeah, at least I can get you a list of books. I just got to figure them out. But I'll put some of the names of these in the chat at the end if I don't run out of time. And so when I say that school bus is a kind of technology, there's two different kinds of technology here. One is the bus itself, right? It's a little ugly, but this is a form of technology. And we'll talk about some details about that in particular. And the other idea is the technology of busing, right? The kind of very foundation of how our school system has responded to desegregation mandates from the Brown versus Board ruling. And so I'm going to look at both of these as we go through this. But to do that, I want to tell you about Kayla. Kayla is a pseudonym, but Kayla is a student who was a kindergartner at the time that I was doing this research. And she lived in a working class community not far from the Stanford campus. Every morning, Kayla, as a 5-year-old, would get on the school bus at 6:30 in the morning in order to get to school at 8 o'clock in a different other somewhat local school district. That ride was about, sometimes she was late, but it was generally over an hour, about 90 minutes in order to get to her new school site. And then she would repeat it, and it'd be about 2 hours coming home every day, right? And this was a voluntary choice that Kayla and her family chose to do in order to have a better learning opportunity. And Kayla and all of the other students on this bus did this as part of a court-mandated requirement allowing students from this particular neighborhood to attend schools in other more affluent school districts, right? There's different kinds of programs like this all over the state, all over the country. It looked like this, right? The young kids sat in the front of the bus. I feel like if we're in a room, I could do a show of hands of if you've been on one of these school buses before. And I think almost all of us, if you've gone to any kind of schooling in the United States, have been on largely an identical kind of bus. Your body can probably remember what it's like to sit on this bus. You can probably feel like the dimpled faux leather vellum of the seats, right? I think we all have the kind of, how the windows open with that kind of weird choreography of your fingers in order to move the windows up and down. And so I feel like we all know what the school bus looks like that Kayla rides every day. Kayla is one of about 700,000 students in California alone who rides the school bus every day. And again, this was as a result of how we decided if schools needed to be desegregated in light of Brown versus Board of Education. The solution to that was to move kids from different schools, right? This was our solution, was busing, and the bus became the mechanism for reshaping what schools in America look like. Not the schools themselves, just who's in them, right? Like we can think of the sorting mechanism of what happens here. At the same time as Brown versus Board, literally the same year is when Dwight Eisenhower introduced the interstate system. And so the very ways that roads operate in this country was introduced parallel to desegregation. When Eisenhower was rolling this out, he offered this quote. It's kind of a verbal press release around all of this. We're pushing ahead with a great road program that will take this nation out of its antiquated shackles of secondary roads all over this country and give us the types of highways that we need. It'll be a nation of great prosperity. It'll be more than that. It'll be a nation that is going ahead every day. And so I want to think through the sense of progress, the sense of moving forward. We can see it both in potentially the vision and the ethos of what was behind Brown versus Board of Education, and the ethos behind getting this country to be further connected and further commutable in different kinds of ways. But all of that kind of progress is at a personal cost for a student like Kayla, right? So every day she's on the school bus for 3 to 4 hours, and she does that for up to 13 years. We can think of, the thousands and thousands of hours, right? In the kind of Malcolm Gladwellian sense, right? Like, what is she becoming an expert in over the time that she's commuting to and from school in this kind of limbo space that's not school, and is also not home, and what are the kinds of key moments that are happening as a result of this, right? And so I just want to kind of think through, like, what are those costs that we think of, and then we compound that across all of these pieces. The metaphor I think about for all of this is that the bus is an opportunity tax, right? That in order for Kayla to have the same kinds of learning opportunities as her more affluent, oftentimes a much wider student population, the kind of school diversity that she was going to got bussed in every day. If I looked at the data on what the school looked like, is at a cost to Kayla and her time, right? Like she pays for this time in order for the same kinds of learning opportunities. And so again, coming back to this kind of first piece, right? I want to think through what might we learn from Kayla, right? If we were to shift from thinking about how do we move Kayla to a place with a better school, what are the lessons that Kayla is also learning, right? In the same way that I was frustrated with the pandemic editorial, what are the lessons we might learn from young people around the pandemic instead of just saying, here's what they've lost, right? I want to know, what can we learn from Kayla as someone who's becoming an expert in bus riding and being a passenger and sitting in a school bus for many, many hours. And the way we do that is we need to think about our sense making as educators and move beyond simply looking at and assessing with the given kinds of assessment data that we have, right? We could see that Kayla is designated as an English learner or an ELL or an English language learner, or potentially an LTEL, right? A long-term English learner, depending on the kinds of trajectories that she might go through. We can think about the kinds of ways that she may or may not perform to the kind of measured forms of progress on math and English assessments. And so again, in these kind of very familiar kinds of ways, rather than thinking about what we can see, I'd want us to think through what are other kinds of sense-making tools that we can have. This picture is of something called the Pinard horn. The Pinard horn was used in obstetrics to understand, to be able to assess the health of a developing fetus inside of a mother before it was born, right? And it was and this was invented in the 1800s. And it was a much less invasive procedure in order to, like a stethoscope, listen and assess health rather than having to feel and be much more invasive with the ways that medical technology was at the time. It's still used today, right? Like this is still a regularly used tool, and it allows us to think about shifting from seeing to shifting towards hearing, right? And what are the other kinds of sense-making tools? And I want us to hold on to that metaphor throughout the rest of this time to kind of think through what we can do. The Pinard horn, unsurprisingly, is named after somebody named Pinard, Adolphe Pinard. And I'll talk very briefly about Pinard a little bit later. But I want us to think through knowing that rather than seeing, what are the things we might learn if we were to listen alongside Kayla. And so my research team and I gave Kayla a decibel meter and asked her to kind of do some sense making and data collection. People are talking about data science these days. And so, this was us collecting data alongside Kayla on the school bus. Kayla and her peers started helping us measure data collection throughout all of this, measuring sound quality throughout their bus rides. We could find out that the loudest part of the school bus, this was data they generated, was from the front of the bus, which makes sense. That's where the kindergartners and first graders sit. And then you kind of get different levels, right? So you get the kind of antsier sixth and seventh graders, and then mid-back were also a louder group. And then by the time you get to seventh and eighth grade, they're too cool, so they're kind of quiet too, right? So you can kind of see like the sentiment of like what the school bus volume was like. They also measured how loud their journey was, right? And so took different measurements along the route of the school bus, and we tried to anonymize the map as much as possible. We can kind of see like what the volume looks like. And it turns out we then started talking to students based on this of, what are the lessons that they would share and how might they redesign. We go into some of this in the book, right? And so the thing that's clear is, kids have a lot to say around all of this. If you actually ask young people, right, how they might transform the world around them, they have a lot to say. And some of you captured this in this opening writing activity around what are you holding on to or letting go, and thinking about the young people in our classrooms. But we usually just don't tend to do that, right? And so the metaphor to think about is that the school bus is a civic space every single day. And as we're getting this place to kind of doing this like huge alternate reality game with young people on this bus, we had this kind of whole fiction narrative. I had other doctoral students who are going to come in and disrupt the bus one day with this larger project. The pandemic happened. And during that period, Kayla was attending school virtually, as were many of us during this time, which meant that Kayla was geographically isolated from all of her classmates, but it also meant that Kayla didn't have to do 3 to 4 hours of commuting every single morning. And we think about those trade-offs look like, and we can think of, while Kayla had to be at home and she had 3 other siblings who were all on Zoom in the same room, right, going to school. Some of her classmates, their families just went to Hawaii, right? We're in the Silicon Valley, they're very wealthy. So some of our classmates got much more time riding their horses. And so we just kind of think of like the different kinds of lessons of what was happening. But the ways that pandemic might not have been fully negative for a student like Kayla in terms of her learning opportunities. At the same time, once we started going back to school, all of those bus drivers had found other kinds of employment because they weren't driving school buses for a large period of time. And so we still have these huge bus driver shortages that we're still trying to figure out right now, which we just think of some of the labor costs as a result of this too. And so, through all of this, I kind of want to think through, where has Kayla gone? What are the kinds of lessons? What are the things that she might be able to tell us about the school bus? When we talk to kids about how they might redesign the school bus, because the design of the bus and its general function hasn't changed over the past 100 years. The primary thing that has changed about the school bus is we've just added more surveillance technology to the bus. Most of them have a GPS tracker, so you can find out if the bus is moved somewhere where it's not allowed to be moved. There's usually cameras inside, so if there's an altercation, there's some kind of video on there that we can see. But generally, like the inside of the bus, other than surveilling kids more, hasn't changed in a century, right? And so as we think about that, we can think about like, what are the other kinds of opportunities of what the school bus could be? And so we started talking to people about this. 1 second. And so I want to come back to this quote from Eisenhower, right? That we're going to be a nation that's going ahead every day. And so as we're driving on the school bus every single day, we would be sitting in traffic in the afternoon. And for some reason, it always seemed like this white bus would always go faster than us, even though they're in the same traffic, right? It always just felt like they're moving faster than us. For those of you who are in the Bay Area, you've probably seen these buses. These are the white buses that are essentially a charter network of bus systems for Facebook, for Google, X, Twitter, whatever it's called now, Apple, right? They have their own bus network for their employees. And you're not allowed to be on these buses unless you are an employee there, because people might be working on, NDA'd information in the background. And so you can't really get on these buses unless you've actually worked for Facebook, for example, or Meta. But I imagine that if we were to go on that bus, it would look and feel very different than the yellow school bus, right? I imagine there's a functioning bathroom on that bus. I bet there's really good snacks. And if there's not really good snacks, but there always are in tech companies, you're definitely allowed to eat your food on the bus. There's probably a barista waiting there to make coffee for you. I bet there's a masseuse, right? Who knows, right? Like any kinds of possibilities are in there, right? Maybe there's a sauna. You can just kind of nicely relax at the end of the day on this bus. But who knows, right? But the point is, right, we know that the bus doesn't have to look the way the yellow school bus does. But because we don't tend to value who young people are, other than as bodies that we need to move like cargo from one place to another, we go with what the yellow school bus has always been, rather than thinking about the other kinds of alternatives and who we might invest in. And so again, rather than thinking about how do we just fix these existing systems, right? Like, what I don't want to say is, well, let's just get a bunch of Google buses and then the busing system's fixed, right? I want us to think through other kinds of alternatives, right? Not better buses, but worlds where we might not need to kind of send young people on 4-hour journeys every single day in the first place, right? And so as we think about centering students, and I've kind of pulled this out of classroom experience to get us started, right? I want us to think through how are youth voices and perspectives shaping your decision-making? How are you centering your students, right? Or if you're a teacher educator, how are you helping your students center their students in their classrooms, right? I want to kind of think through these pieces as we're thinking about it. I mentioned this guy, Pernard. I'm going to use him as my transitional piece here. And so again, Adolphe Pernard, he created this really powerful tool that's been a useful metaphor for me throughout the pandemic. And in doing that, I wanted to start reading some very basic information about who Adolphe Pernard was. Clearly, he's big enough to have his own horn. It's got to be a big deal. And so when you read kind of general biography information about him, he's clearly seen as this kind of well-loved individual, right? A generous and devoted, hardworking, great teacher, right? Kind of like a well-respected person in French medicine. And then at the same time, if you just kind of dig through his Wikipedia page, right? It's not difficult information to find. Pinard is also the founder of one of the founding members of the French Eugenics Society, right? And so you know, was very very deeply ingrained in the eugenics movement, as was Stanford, right? Like the universities, the building that I used to teach in, the founding person for Stanford's School of Education was one of the leading eugenicist individuals, right? Eugenicist researchers in America. And so I just want to recognize that I'm not putting Pinard on the hook here as much as putting us as a collective on the hook and thinking through who are our responsibilities and who do we hold on to? What are the things we might value from someone in terms of the contributions of Pinard, who saved countless lives with his invention, right? And at the same time has values that are fundamentally against the kind of well-being of a student like Kayla, right? If we think of the kinds of perspectives that he's sharing. And so I want to hold on to that tension and think through what kinds of expertise gets to count in our work as we're thinking about centering young people and thinking about what voices we bring in, what's permissible in all of this. And so in thinking about that, I want to talk through authentic expertise. And so, you know, I'm gonna skip this, but I was gonna play a short clip where I talked with one of my former students. This is me pre having kids. So when I had non-gray hair, alongside one of my students, Roger. And we had a very short conversation together. Well, we had a 2.5 hour conversation about various aspects of our experiences being in classrooms together. This got cut down for NPR to a 2-minute clip that is about Roger knowing when he was going to drop out of high school, right? And there's, you know, dramatic music that's played in the background. It's very evocative. I sound amazing in it. I'm not going to play it for you. You can look it up if you really wanted to see it, right? But instead, what I want us to think about from that journey, right, from Roger, is the ways we're expected to think about the great teacher narrative, right? The teacher who cares, and the ways you try to pull forward your students, and how that you will try as hard as you can. And as many of you on the Zoom know, you won't get all of your students, right? There will always be a student who falls through the cracks, despite how much work we put into it, right? And that is heartbreaking. And we still regularly think of, you know, what are the things I could have done differently? But in doing that, right, I think what I want us to get to is this idea of how do you get to see your students differently? Or how do you sense make with your students differently, right? If we know that every student is different, right, how do we build up trust and relationships? Those are the kind of very basic building blocks, but the ones where oftentimes there's the biggest barriers for us to get to do the work that we want to do, right? Some of the basic things of what this looks like in my English classroom, this looks like autoethnographies, right? The ways that I might, rather than just tell a story or a personal narrative about myself, I might connect that personal narrative to a larger kind of sense of global conflict. My colleague Emma Gargretzi, who's now at UT Austin, she talks about these as methographies, where students get to talk about their relationship to numbers, numeracy, quantitative reasoning. And so that students who might not feel particularly comfortable or feel like they're quote unquote bad at math, they get to do some unpacking of where that relationship comes from, right? Where was that embedded into their learning experience? And so across kind of all subject areas, I think the ways we get to know our students is by allowing them to share who they are vis-a-vis the kinds of disciplinary topics that we're teaching. If you're doing a big poetry unit, some students might feel really connected to poetry. Some students might feel they're kind of pushing against this. It's kind of like a magnetic push against it in some sense. And so where's that coming from, right? And so for all of these pieces, right, I think that the kind of pragmatic piece I'll offer here is that it's really okay to ask, right? I think oftentimes the sage on the stage mantra means that we're expected to somehow know what are all of the answers all the time, right? I think the most powerful words as teachers, some of the most powerful words as teachers that we can say are, I don't know, right? I think regularly allow our young people to see us not being the experts in the room, allowing young people to center themselves as the experts in these spaces, and that becomes a dialogic space for us to move forward, right? This is just a screenshot from, and I guess this will be recorded so you can capture this later. This is just a screenshot from the Heinemann book. So you can kind of see some of the ways that opening routines might share different kinds of feelings of either connection or disconnection, right? So, when you just post a list of rules at the beginning of the school year, right, that might feel like, you're resigned to being stuck in this class, versus if you create prompts for young people to kind of participate with envisioning the classroom for them, that might be an affirming space, right? And then similarly, there might be like a more kind of gallery walk model, and that might even feel potentially more democratic. You've probably done different kind of degrees of this. You might have pushed it further. I just want to offer some like very pragmatic ways to think through. Not here's what the right routine is. That right routine is going to depend on you and your students, but to think through, if this is the routine you're choosing, right? Here's the ways that this routine might shape the affect, the feeling, the temper, the temperature, the tenor, the temperature. Those are the words I was looking for within your classroom, right? So just kind of naming those pieces. So it's not saying try this instead of this. It's saying these routines might reveal this about what your classroom is going to do for the next few months together. So these are, again, I want to throw some pragmatic stuff in here, so I'm not just talking at you this entire time. So some things you might want to think about is some questions for you to consider. How do you currently get to know your students, right? That might just be informally, right? But do you have built-in mechanisms that by the end of the year, you get to know every student in the way that they want to be known by you? And what do you want to change about the relationships they maintain in your classroom, right? Is it, do you know that you are maybe not connecting with certain students in a certain way? Is there a particular kind of barrier, right? What are the things that are getting in your way? I think being able to name those, right? Or even being able to recognize that you can't name those are a really important step to think about, right? So, I'm really struggling understanding Kayla. I'm going to come back to the same student's name, right? I'm not sure why, but unlike other students, I feel like the student's not resonating with me in these ways. Start figuring out what those pieces are so you can kind of figure out what these pieces are, right? Okay. So again, the provocation for the second part, only 2 out of 6. We're definitely not getting through all 6, but we'll get through like 4.5, maybe 5. How does authentic expertise and voice emerge in your classroom? All right, so digital lives. I want to tell you about La Cuenta. I want you all to go to lacuenta.substack.com. Maybe someone can put that in the chat, please. And I want you to subscribe if you're not a subscriber. It is a weekly newsletter that I help curate, but my goal with La Cuenta is to use Stanford's resources and distribute that to other people who are involved with it, right? Thank you, Deborah, for putting that in. I really appreciate it. So go to La Cuenta. It is a weekly newsletter. Today, we put up a thing thinking about Substack is a problematic website that maybe is embracing Nazis, like literal modern day Nazis. And so we're thinking through what is our home. But other than myself, as someone who has a lot of privilege and use the spaces of Stanford, La Cuenta is fully run and written and compensated for the writing of individuals who are currently or formerly labeled undocumented. If that includes any of your students or community members or family members, we would welcome them anonymously or non-anonymously to contribute to La Cuenta. Get in touch. We pay our writers, we pay our photographers, and the idea is every week somebody shares. La Cuenta is the word for bill in Spanish, and so every week we share the bill, and I'll show you an example in a second. And I do this with Alik Stick, who is the person in this picture. This is actually at the UC Irvine presentation from last month. The two of us presenting a workshop together. So we just celebrated our first year anniversary back in September. And in that first year, we counted over 80 different costs of what it means to be undocumented in this country. And these are some of the examples, right? The cost of, and that you could go and explore this. We just don't have time for it, I don't think right now, so I'm not gonna do it. But there's all these different kinds of things, right? So the cost of not being like other immigrants, the cost of paying taxes in a country where you can't actually benefit from those taxes, the cost of going to the emergency room if you're undocumented, the cost of delivering a baby or being an undocumented mother, right? We have lots of different kinds of experiences and really beautiful stories that I think happen in this space. And you might have folks who might contribute to this too, right? So I want to remind you. And so again, let me just jump ahead. The idea with, let me go back here. The idea with La Cuenta is the word means bill in Spanish. And so like when you go to a restaurant, you might ask for La Cuenta at the end if you want to pay for the meal before you leave. And so the idea is if you were undocumented in this country and you could offer a bill back to the United States for the kinds of costs that you incurred, wage exploitation, right? The kinds of ways that you might not be able, you pay taxes, but you're not allowed to actually use those taxes. The cost of not being able to visit your family who might be in a different part of the country or the world, all these different kinds of pieces that cost you financially, physically, emotionally, mentally. what would you put on that bill? And we've made note cards around this. So for those of you who are educators or interested in doing like a curriculum around this, the green screen's not going to let me, maybe if I can sneak it here around my face. No, it never works. But we created these note cards so that people can write their own bill and kind of name them. And we've been collecting these. And so each week is about presenting a different kind of cost, right? Is really what this comes from. And so we have a whole bunch of pieces in here. We've talked to some like really amazing writers. Even though she's not undocumented, the person we're presenting next week is the author Erica Sanchez. She's the author of the book I'm Not Your Perfect Mexican Daughter. We talked to her about the cost of book banning for undocumented young women who read her books and are kind of transformed by her stories. And so that's like a really powerful conversation. We'll share that next week on La Cuenta. If there's people that you are interested in hearing in this space, again, big plug just for you to kind of think through like what are the voices here. All of this to say, what we want to think through with all of this is how do you center expertise in storytelling as research, right? How does that show up in these spaces for you? This isn't just about individual dignity, right? But it's about kind of flipping these pieces. This is the postcard. So actually, let me read this really quickly. So on the back of the postcard is my co-presenter Alixa's story, right? And she says, I was an immigrant working at a restaurant in Atlanta when my tooth became infected. Unable to afford $1,500 for medical care, I ignored it. For 8 months, the pain increased, sometimes leaving me unable to sleep. One night, I woke with blood pooling on my neck. The infection had spread to my ear, affecting my hearing, which I never regained. I often apologize for this. I'm sorry, what did you say? I'm apologizing for the cost of American living for someone like me. And then you can see that she has a bill, and on the back of the bill, she wrote like the things she's charging America for here is 1 ear, right? Like whatever the value of an ear of your hearing is, as well as weekly therapy related to complex PTSD. And she kind of talks through those experiences. Again, if you're interested in these note cards, get in touch, or these postcards, because we have a curriculum around them. But all of this is about authenticity, right? So setting aside this particular kind of investment in immigration, and with like a much longer thing, if any of you want to talk about immigration and education, reach out. We've been doing a lot of work around this topic. But setting aside immigration in particular, this is about how do we bring authentic expertise into classrooms. My friend and colleague, Joe Pullman, who's at UC Boulder, he talks about 3 different ways to think about authenticity. There's authentic cultural tools, there's authentic audiences or communities, and there's authentic student agency. I'd say all 3 of those are like a nice heuristic to think about in terms of how are you doing quote unquote authentic learning opportunities in our classroom. And so again, for you, this might be around book choice, right? It might be around, you know what, Erica Sanchez's book can mean a lot to my students, right? Like what does that look like for me, right? It could also mean building off of young people's interests. I did a lot of research around students writing letters during a former election and thinking through like the ways students' interests could shape civic identity and civic development. But really, I think a lot of this this is theoretically about technology, but to me, the technology is we don't need to use fancy tools. We can use problematic platforms, and we can use analog technology and digital tools to essentially connect young people to the real world around them. You don't need ChatGPT. You don't need eye tracking software, right? When it comes to technology, use technology as the fundamental to bring us closer to one another. I think that's the key thing to think about. And I guess for cool green screen things like this, it can make my head feel good. All right, great. Number 4. Hey, we're not doing too bad. 4, we're halfway there. I'm gonna try to wrap up in 10 minutes so that we can have a little bit of Q&A at the end. So playing's good. I'm gonna ignore this. This was a funny thing about sandwiches. Uncrustables, they taste good. That was the kind of lesson there. When it comes to play, there's a game I used to like playing with my students called the Game of Phones, and I also play this with my pre-service teachers. It would look something like apples to apples, and so I'd ask you all to kind of say or probably type in the chat your app of shame. There's a game about finding stars on my phone that I've spent obnoxious amounts of time playing, and it's not fun, and it's smart, and it's really embarrassing. And that would have been my app of shame right now. But I just kind of think through like what are the ways that we can be playful. Every game is a learning game, so I just want to kind of like name that piece of what gaming looks like. And yes, Carlos, Erica Sanchez's book is being adapted into a film right now. She talked a little bit about that too, which I thought was just an interesting side note. I had a whole thing to tell you about Pac-Man and the kind of brilliance of Pac-Man as a game for learning. Pretend I said it, it's really powerful. It's not necessary for our conversation here, right? The thing to say is, what I don't want you to do is the chocolate-covered broccoli approach, right? Rather than think through Oregon Trail, Carmen Sandiego, the edutainment games, most of those are really bad because if you don't want to play it at home for fun, it's probably not a game your students want to play in your classroom either, right? And so I want you to think through, what are the ways we can authentically recognize who our students are and value their learning, right? Can you hack existing games? Can you use social games? Can you think about storytelling? Things like Werewolf, Blood on the Clock Tower, right? These are games that kids like to play, and they're the ways that you can like build or adapt those kinds of tools in your own classroom. I'm going to skip the magic circle. I'm going to skip some of this. And so when it comes to play, questions for you to consider: is your classroom a space where student play and joy are centered? If not, why not, right? Or if you think it could be better, what could you do to make it better? I want to skip healing, but it feels like a really cool thing to do. So I'll just briefly say, as I think about healing, I've learned a lot of lessons from my colleague, Mark Gomez. He and I helped open the school, the Critical Design and Gaming School, also in South Central Los Angeles. And what I regularly think about with a teacher like Mark, and in my own experience, is the way that you might experience a tremendous loss as a teacher. There might be a loss in your school community, and we have to go through this kind of Clark Kent-like transformation or Superman-like transformation, but make it less gendered. Carol Danvers, is that you go through this transformation of caring for your students, and then you have to go home and be a part of a family. And what you never do is get the space to grieve for yourself, because you're caring for a community at school and a community at home. And where do teachers get to care for themselves, right? It's the question I want us to think about. So the question is, how are you caring for yourself and cultivating the support of your peers, particularly as we're coming out of the pandemic? We've experienced tremendous forms of loss, right? What are the kinds of ways that we've gained from that, right? And so what are the healing possibilities that you are cultivating within your school tomorrow? What's stopping you from healing? How do you center care and healing right now for your colleagues, for your students, for your profession, for yourself? And then I think I can land this in the last couple of minutes. So the last thing I'll say is I got really into, they're all in the garage. I got into typewriters during the pandemic. It's a nice, very heavy thing to get shipped to your house. But typewriters, are this kind of like beautiful thing that kind of move. And if you look on your keyboard right now, since most of you are in front of a computer, you have a shift button, right? That shift is about literally the carriage shifts so that the keys can be from lowercase to uppercase, right? There's no reason on our keyboard to have a shift button, but we just know it, and we've imported that as the label for capitalizing words, because it's what we used 100 years ago when people used typewriters, right? And so I want us to think through, in that same way that we've adapted old technology that is essentially obsolete on our keyboard today, what are the things that we're shifting away from? We're shifting away from broken systems, broken practices, broken pedagogies. There's another button that's also doing the same kind of thing on our keyboard, and that's the return button. I have two different keyboards in front of me. I have like a physical keyboard here, and then this is on a laptop, and so the laptop also has a keyboard. On the physical keyboard, the button says enter, but on my laptop it says return. I'm curious if your computer either says return or enter, but most of them tend to say return. And again, that is the technology, that is language from the typewriter, that when you would type, the carriage would move over, and when you got to the end of the page, you'd have to press a button and return it back over, right? That's why it's called a return. That return button is, again, typewriter technology brought back into the modern day in a way that is weird that we use it today and nobody thinks about that, right? And so in the same way that we're trying to shift away from particular things, I also want us to return back to human-centered reading, writing, relationships, right? We don't need to return to algorithmic assumptions of what technology should be, right? We need to move away from these other pieces, right? Yeah, Jim, I think that's right. We still use the term dial for our phones. We still call it a cell phone. We still call them phones in particular, when most of the time we don't actually use these as devices for calling, right? The amount of time I do this with my phone, if it's on the green screen, compared to 90% of the other things I do with it, is kind of striking, right? But I appreciate that connection. Okay, so again, how are you shifting these provocations across your career is kind of the last piece I want to say here. We end each La Cuenta post. I'm going to wrap up in the next 4 minutes so that we can have a little bit of time as a whole group with any kinds of questions or concerns. But we end each La Cuenta post with a propina, which is just tip in Spanish. And these tips are just kind of extra pieces to connect with. My co-author for the Heinemann book, Ernest Morel, he'd always tell the young people we're working with in these YPAR projects, youth participatory action research projects, don't let the adults in the room leave without getting their marching orders, the ways that they're supposed to work with you, right? And so in the same kinds of spirits of offering a propina or a marching order, I want to kind of take these 6 kinds of pieces and tell you about one of my daughters. I have twin daughters. They're both 4. That's how twins work, if you don't know. And so the only one of them is photogenic and gets a picture on today's slide. This is Joey. Like Joey from Whittier. She's not named after Joey from Whittier on this chat. She's actually named after my dad. But this is Joey and I at the zoo, looking at a zebra, and Joey, one of Joey's favorite animals. Her sister Stella, her favorite animal is the anteater. But the anteater doesn't work for the story. So Joey was looking at the zebra, and I told Joey, did you know that the zebra has the largest heart of any mammal? Joey did not care at all about this, turns out, right? Like she came to the zoo. She didn't come for her dad to mansplain animal facts to her. And so, but I was feeling pretty good about this fact until later that night. I went to double check this thing that I heard one time, and it turns out it's not correct. Giraffes don't have the largest heart of mammals. Instead, it turns out that the giraffe's heart beats faster than most other mammals on the planet. It beats twice as fast as humans, right? And which is kind of the same speed as developing fetuses, right? So you can think through like the kind of galloping sound of unborn children, right? And kind of like the pace that you can hear there. And the reason it beats so fast is, right, so that blood can be pumped up at the very long neck of a giraffe. And so I was thinking about this and kind of thinking through, the kind of beauty of like, what would it mean to think about the kinds of ways we might all kind of have these giraffe hearts inside us, right? What are the kinds of ways we can think about co-constructing so that someone like Joey can be loved harder, can be loved faster, can be loved in harder ways as a young brown girl who's going to be entering our public school system in the next year, right? We're figuring out the kindergarten that she's going to. We drive past it all the time. She's kind of processing all of that, right? My co-creator of La Cuenta, Alix, has talked about this in terms of being unrealistic, right? We talk about learning loss and how we just need to fix our existing schools. But for someone like Alix who cannot access many of the same kinds of social structures in the US that I'm able to as someone who's a US citizen, she realizes that like the way that she thrives in this country, she has to be unrealistic. What are the ways that we can push against the taken for granted of the world around us and kind of see that as, false barriers, right? That there's other ways to live and thrive in this country if we can choose to be unrealistic. And so we need to set unrealistic expectations. We need to move towards unrealistic horizons, not build within the fixed boundaries of our own classroom, and think about what that might look like outside of this space. I think we have about 7 minutes for conversation if there's anything people would like to say. Maybe I'll stop sharing so that I'm not like a tiny little dot down here. And I'll put my email in the chat so people can reach out if you'd like to. Stop sharing. I don't know if people are able to unmute or how we can hear from people, if there's any Q&A.
Yeah, so we can help bring you questions from the chat. And Deborah, let us know if you've got any questions to start.
And first I'd like to say thank you for the presentation and the information, and there's a lot there to process. There's a couple of points that I was trying to catch that I missed. And so the 6 tricks for tuning in to teaching and seeing your class, recognizing the class not for content in terms of what we're learning in books and subject matter, but for content in terms of who is actually in the class, and for the strategies that you use for getting to know students. I used to do an activity that it was 10 things you should know about me. And it started with something as simple as I like colors. And so they would see me wearing a lot of vibrant colors. And then it went on to, I love shoes. But ultimately, once we got through the 10 things you should know about me, it became the 10 thing for them to write 10 things I should know about them. And those 10 things had nothing to do with what we were going to learn in class, but they were things that I should know about them. Do you have siblings you have to take care of after school? Do you work? And the way those things build community goes beyond just a long way. It speaks volumes to I'm seeing you. So what are other ways that we use to see our students? Or do we even bother to
Yeah,
try and see them?
I love that. I love that example, Deborah. And I think what I appreciate about it is I think it feels like you're not giving yourself the kind of credit for that work that maybe you intend in terms of um although this sounds like I'm mansplaining your project back to you, I apologize. But my sense is you're saying like I'm gonna learn these things about you, and it's not necessarily about the classroom, or it's not necessarily about our curriculum, but the students are learning something tremendous about the ways that you're caring and loving for them in that
Mhm.
activity, right? In ways that I think are really important for our pedagogy. They just don't show up on the assessment at the end of the year, right? But if I had to guess, right, and students are looking back on the times that they were in Ms. Robinson's classroom, right? They're not thinking about the times that they had to write the persuasive essay, right? They're probably thinking about the times that you made those connections, or about the cool, colorful clothes or shoes that you wore, right? Like those are going to be the things that linger with them, right? There will be maybe some academic stuff if you're lucky, right? But it is
Yes.
those other pieces, right? And I think really, some of the other writing I've been doing lately is about the idea that every teacher, and in particular English teachers, are civics educators, right? I think
Mhm.
I have this quasi fight that my colleague Nicole Mira and I have been having with the field of social studies, where social studies teachers think that they are the kind of bastion of teaching civics education, but they're wrong. And I actually
Absolutely.
think that like the ways we learn to be in community with one another, the ways that we learn to be leaders, is through our relationship with each other, oftentimes fomented in our English classrooms, right? And so, to your question of like, how do you get to know? I think it depends on. I think there's a level of discomfort for many of our new teachers and later teachers as they get kind of re-entrenched in these processes, because we're not taught how to disclose who we are as human beings to our
Mhm.
students, right? It doesn't show up in our pre-service classes. It's not part of professional development. And I think that's a real misstep, right? That part of the ways that students get to know who we are is about us being vulnerable with them and about building up those relationships with them. But that takes a lot of practice, and it takes a lot of vulnerability. And that can be really uncomfortable for teachers who aren't used to doing those kinds of things. It's not necessarily what people sign up for when they're becoming teachers, but it
Mhm.
probably should be, right? It's maybe kind of my thinking around this. And so, part of, I don't have the like, here's 5 easy strategies on how to share who you are with your students, right? Because I think it's going to depend. Like, I really like your list of here's 10 things about me. I think it's like an opening bid, right? I think on the other hand, another way to think about it is, what are the things I'd want people to know about me, and what are the ways I can share that, right? I might bring in, my nerdy typewriter collection on day one. And they're like, oh, I see what I'm in for with this person, right? And I'll say maybe one quick thing, and I'm aware of our time. My first year teaching, uh, a week before my school year started, I got Bell's palsy, which is this thing where half of your face is paralyzed, and you have to like manually blink your eye. It is kind of a bummer, and so like that's kind of annoying. But the problem with Bell's palsy, the first year of teaching, is that if you try to smile when you have Bell's palsy, you can only smile with half of your face. So you kind of smile like this, and you look monstrous, I think. Um, and so I had the same level of sarcasm that I've had with all of you for the past hour, but now I had it with kids who've never met me before. And they're like, who is this person who's not smiling and just delivering like the driest language ever, right? Like you just kind of think they're like, what have I done here, right? And I had to kind of be very upfront with my students, like, hey, my face doesn't work right now, and I'd love to smile with all of you and like get to know you all. And also, as my first year teaching, I had no idea what I was doing, right? But I just kind of like recognize we had to build up this trust in a different kind of way at the beginning. I'm going to stop sharing that story because we have like a minute, maybe, if anyone has like a very short question before we run
Well,
out of time.
some of the things that are in the chat are actually personal for you.
Oh,
There's a
great.
message from, and you probably are the
Oh,
only one
wow.
who can see it, but Adrienne says, Antero used your research in my dissertation and finally saw you at the UCI writing project in December. And
Oh,
it's
cool.
thank you for all of your perspectives. Um, we are
Yeah, say,
1 minute from signing off.
And can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
please.
Antero, do you have a student-friendly definition for authenticity?
Yeah, I think authenticity comes down to, oh, and I love the cat. The cat said
Sorry,
a good cameo.
I don't know what her question is.
I think the authenticity is about a sense of realness that people, they can't be faked, right? I think it's just like a very obvious thing, right? Is there something that can't be faked, right? Is there something where it's a real connection to it might be the way to answer it. I'll just say, I think for those of you who connected that I missed this in the chat, so feel free to send me an email. I'd love to stay in touch with any of you, or not. Don't, if you feel grumpy about this, don't get in touch. But if you do, please do.
Jennifer, when I thought about I listened to your question about authenticity, and I thought about when I was my first year teacher and being told that you don't smile at your students for the first like 6 months. And coming into the classroom, I was like, there is no way I can do that. I mean, just walking in, it was like, I felt tickled just walking into the room and standing before those kids. So sometimes it was just because I couldn't, okay, now let me pull myself together and I'm going to deliver this thing, but it's so weird just being here. So that authenticity, that idea of you have to be your real self no matter what. Even if your real self is sarcastic and grumpy, but at least they know that's just who you are. It's nothing personal.
And I'm putting my email address in the chat for John. Thanks for asking for that. I appreciate it.
And thank you, Jim, for your comment.
Yeah, thank you. It's great to be in conversation with all of you. I really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you very much for joining us. And I will be emailing you again within the week.
Awesome. All right. Take care, everybody.
This was wonderful. Thanks so much.
Thanks. It's good to see you all.